This is an interview with Robert Despain on May 10th, 2003 in Eugene, Oregon. And Robert was involved in the fair for many years and still is. And how can you tell me about your first involvement with the country fair?
Well, I snuck into the country fair in 1979 and was president 3 years later. So it's kind of a fast story, actually. In 1980, or in the fall of 1979, I started going to community village coordinator meetings because my wife at the time, Jean Marie, was on the coordinating council. And then within a few months of participating, I was invited to join. So community village coordinating council from 1980 to 82. And then a big shift happened with the main camp personnel. There were the core group, maybe 7 or 8 people, all resigned. And I ended up being the only officer of the board left involved, and I was secretary at the time, so I automatically became the other positions and held a retreat and started empowering other people that knew more about the operations of the fair than I did, and got things refocused to a future that we all would create.
So there was this reorganization of the leadership of the fair.
Yes. Actually, that was quite a big deal because the people who had brought the fair up from toddler stage and had raised the $100,000 to make the land payment, completed in 1982, and we bought the land in 1982. They were really dedicated, really hard-working folks, and they ran things in their own way, which was not as it is these days. So when they all left after the Grateful Dead concert in 1982, is when they resigned. There wasn't anybody left from the old guard. Sandra Bauer did return and help us the following year, and since then she's been involved. But she stood back and watched and let us recreate the type of communication system and the organization that we were going to use. And another thing that has dramatically affected the way things ran in the country fair in 1983, which was my first year as general manager, was that there was 2 weeks of rain prior to the fair happening, and it became necessary to make some, what would you call, emergency decisions. And so as the fair time was approaching and there was more and more and more mud on the trail and people were bringing their thing, we wouldn't let them drive in, so it got messier and messier as they were walking in with all of the pottery and the clothes and their booth materials and their camping equipment, all of that. By Thursday night, and it was still raining, we decided they were here, we were going to go for it. And on Friday morning, at 5 o'clock in the morning, I was up on a picnic table like this one in main camp, and there were about 30 people or so that I'd asked to get up and start this thing. And I laid out a plan to how we were going to clean the fair up. And we were going to scrape the mud off the path with our shovels, buckets, sticks, our hands, everything and anything to get the mud off of the path. And I sent Craig Patterson out to find hay and gave him some names from local farmers, and we did. We went out onto the path, and the booth people joined in immediately. There must have been 1,000 muddy people cleaning up the paths, and there was, I don't know, lots of mud, 50 yards of mud pushed off the trails, and it was just piled there temporarily. And Craig came back with the hay, and people were kicking it out and spreading it out on the path. And so by the time we got to the upper end, up the Upper River Loop, with raking off the mud and spreading out the hay, it was 11 o'clock and the gates opened down below. And there was a lot of happy people because it was fresh and it smelled great up until about Sunday when it started smelling like silage. But what I was getting to was that because we had such a community experiencing saving the fair together that year, and it's still talked about, we just couldn't chase people out on Sunday night, which was the typical and traditional thing to do. Before we owned the land, you were gone on Sunday night, and the staff left on Monday, and maybe half a dozen people cleaned up for a week, and they were gone. Well, this was the first year that we actually owned the land for the fair event, and we'd had a catastrophe narrowly averted, and we decided to allow people to stay overnight and take their time getting out, and that became the tradition. So there was a change in the way that we lived on the land for that short period of time, and the way that we stewarded the land began then. So much nurturing and caring started right there in 1982. I think the following year we wrote the Code of Conduct, which encompassed how we treated ourselves and each other and the land. And things have grown since then from those foundations.
Now, who were the folks, kind of the change of the leadership in 81, after the Grateful Dead concert and everything? Who were those core folks who were in the leadership prior to that time?
Boy, I hope I don't miss anybody. Ron Chase, Sandra Bauer, Nancy Albro, Michael Kilgallen, Terry Patrick, Reese Prouty. Reese is still there and Sandra's still there. Jill Hyman. And of course there were others. I mean, there's probably 20 or 30 other folks that were coordinators then that are still around now. But those are the core folks that really ran the main camp scene.
Mm-hmm. And you were an unpaid fair manager from 82 or 3 through 1990. Was that about right?
No, that's a little bit longer. I became... should never do this again, but I became the president of the board and the general manager of the fair at the same time, and I also was the construction coordinator, the printing coordinator, one of the entertainment coordinators, and the main camp kitchen coordinator and the main camp coordinator, a bunch of stuff, because it was vacant, it was void. So I had the responsibility, I had to dish out and delegate as much as I could possibly do. But that happened, I think, in 1983 was the new group of people coming in, and then I was manager 83, 84, and 85, and then I resigned as general manager and stayed on in other capacities, 16 of them since then. So it's changed a lot over the years. I mean, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Edit.
But I understand Arna Shaw became the first paid fair manager around 1990. So who took over as general manager after you?
1986 was Douglas Parker, and 1 year. 87, I think it was Sally Edmonds, and frankly, I'm missing. I don't know when Arna came on, so there might have been one other person that I don't remember there, or maybe Sally ran it for a few years.
So tell me about some of your other roles in the fair after you resigned as general manager up until the present, really.
Okay, let's see. Well, in '86, I started helping in with the inventory, the T-shirts and posters and things like that. for a couple of years, and I think I was a vaudeville coordinator in 1987 and maybe 88, something like that. And let's see. Have worked on construction from time to time, a connection with heavy equipment. So I was bringing backhoe or graders and road building equipment, things like that in for all of that period of time, always contributing something like that. Was a media coordinator for about 5 years up until last year, 2002. I resigned, and Jenny Knutson took over on that, and I started the spoken word program along with, Leslie and I germinated the idea in 2001, and we had one speaker there. It was not very well coordinated, and last year Laura Stewart started helping me coordinate the spoken word program, and so now this year we're very well coordinated. We've got a great group of people, and it is pretty much my sole function. Mm-hmm. There, I'm not doing anything else mm-hmm. but spoken word.
Mm-hmm. So what were or some are some of your accomplishments for the fair?
Let's see. Well, we talked about the reorganization that happened in 1982. When the old guard left, the experience left, and so I created the financial committee and the basis of the management structure that exists now. Back then it was called the OM team, operational management team, and now it's called the backup management team, or the BUMS. And the idea was that not only did I not have the experience to, just jump in and run the fair as it had been done before, I didn't have the recognition with the people, and they had more experience than I did, the other coordinators. So there was a shift in the style of communication, becoming more, cooperative as a group, if you will. Mm-hmm. And we created the systems that exist pretty much now, except now, and for the last 11 or 12 years, we've had really strong general management with Leslie Scott. Mm-hmm. So that's been a blessing, because mm-hmm. she's shown such leadership. Let's see, in 1985, we were being threatened by the Oregon Department of Transportation wanting to put a highway right through the country fair, and we beat them. John Stamp and Jim Guthrie and I were basically the only players. It started in '84 after the country fair. We got a letter from, we got a letter from ODOT inviting us to participate in a minor partitioning hearing. It was the very first time that we had heard that there was going to be a move of the highway plans, because we were aware, since they bought the right of way that the highway exists on right now in 1969, and they did some archaeology out there. We knew that that's where they planned to be. There just wasn't any idea of when. So in '84, they announced that they had made some important discoveries archaeologically, and that they were going to hold hearings along the northern side of the highway right-of-way for people to get involved in the process, because they were planning on moving the highway to the north. They were calling it minor partitioning because you were dividing up properties. Well, that was our foot in the door. And I'm so happy that there was a place to wedge our foot in the door. We went to that first hearing, which was in front of the Lane County Commissioners, and we pointed up that that ODOT had not done their EIS study, their environmental impact statement, and that's required by law. And so I can remember vividly that Jerry Rust told ODOT that they should go home and do their homework. And so it set up a dynamic between us and ODOT so that the country fair personnel became the obstacle. And ODOT painted the country fair as obstructionists to the public, and especially to the Veneta community. So for about 8 months, there were several public meetings because they had to hold public processes and they had to respond to everything that we brought to them. And every time that they held a meeting, we came with new ammunition that they had to then follow up. And they had to either establish their credibility with their process, or they had to refute, or they had to remediate. So there were, let's see, 1 or 2 more meetings with Lane County Commissioners. There was a meeting with Historical Preservation Society. There were several. I think it was about 6 or so. And every time we threw another wrench in the works for them. So they stopped having the public meetings, and they called a meeting in Salem at the Attorney General's office. And the people who were there were all old fogies. There was the ODOT themselves, the Attorney General, a couple of representatives. There was Lane County and Lane County's attorney, LCOG, Oregon Historical Preservation Society, and us, the 3 of us. By that time, I had cut my hair and my beard off, and I looked pretty much like I do right now. John looks like John looks right now, and Jim looked like Jim looks right now. And Bill Close was our attorney at the time, and he had come looking like an attorney. So the archaeologist on our side was late for the meeting, and we were all sitting around this long table in the Attorney General's office, and all of those guys were completely ignoring us and laughing and joking among themselves about how they were going to annihilate us. And so our archaeologist walked in about 20 minutes late, slapped his books down on the table, and he said, "Well, I just found out that you guys haven't filed for the National Oregon Historical Preservation Society for 4.5 years, and you're supposed to do it every 6 months." And the ODOT guys and a couple of others just started making a hell of a commotion, and one of the ODOT guys stood up and pounding on the table, and "You freaking hippies" isn't exactly what he said, but they were very irate. And so we knew we had him at that point, because it was just one more obstacle that they couldn't overcome. And 3 weeks later, they made the decision to revert back to their previous site. See, the whole issue was about the cultural materials in the ground that the Kalapuya, the Chelamela band of the Kalapuya, had brought there. And what we did to beat them was we traipsed around in the Long Tom, in the bottom of the Long Tom, in the mud, until we found the archaeology in the right-of-way that they wanted to use, and we forced them to dig up the very evidence that was going to defeat them. So it was well crafted on our part, and I'm very happy about that accomplishment.
So tell me, they wanted, at first they were going to make a right-of-way change where the highway is now, but there was some archaeological material found there, and so they wanted to move it over to fair property, and then you showed them that there was archaeological material there too.
Yes. And
you might as well just go back to your original plan.
That's exactly right. That is the gist of the story, and there's much in between. They had a guy from the university that will go unnamed, who was going to make him a name for himself. And so he pumped up $500,000 in a budget that he needed in order to find out about the Chelamela band of the Kalapuya, because no one had really ever known anything, and here it was, you know. Well, he didn't need $500,000, and we went through all of our legal channels and gave them options and threw up obstacles in front of them until we beat them. But it was all over archaeology. So now they're back. That highway is on the original site.
Okay.
There were a few other accomplishments during that time period, and I think, for the large part, that the ideas were just ripe. For instance, the Peach Pit. The concept originated in '83. And we tried it as a newsletter, but it just really didn't have much circulation. but then other people took it over and developed it with more skills again than I, and I think Ann Henry ushered it into something real, and now there's a whole crew, Amy Wolfson and a crew that work on the Peach Pit. The bumper stickers originated in 1983, and they're still going strong. Let's see. Oh, the six-pack toilets. That was probably, you don't talk too much about that part of the function of the fair, but in the old days, prior to the six-packs, the septic pumper truck would come right into the fair and pump the toilets during the event, and it was pretty ugly. So sitting around talking to Michael Kilgallen one day, I suggested a solution, and he said, "Oh no, that'll never work." So we made it work. We built the first six-pack toilet in a community village in 1982, and by the fall of '82, before the Grateful Dead concert, the main camp had built one next to main camp, and then now I think there's 9 of them. But the beauty of this system is you don't have to bring the truck in. You don't have to pump them until the end of the event. So it's much nicer. Many improvements. There's lots of stories, but that's a synopsis of some of the major stuff.
I don't want to cut off your stories. Do you have other stuff there you want to talk about? Or I have things like, what are some of your favorite fair moments or places of the fair or acts of the fair, or just, I remember this time this happened, or can you... That's kind of like stories.
Yeah, those are kind of like stories. Well, actually, I think my all-time highlight in all of this experience was last year when Ram Dass came to the country fair to speak as a guest in honor of Ken Kesey's passing. Kesey had asked him for years and years to come to the country fair, and he just never did it. And Paul Krasner, too. They just never came until Ken was gone. So they both came, and Ram Dass, as you may have seen, was on the main stage and spoke for 45 minutes. And when he was coming off of the back end of the stage, I was in front of him on the ramp and had a hold of his wheelchair, and he leaned up and he said, "How did I do?" And I said, "Are you kidding? There are 5,000 people out there standing in the hot sun, and you can hear a pin drop. They loved you. There's never been that many people that quiet for that long." And he says, "Well, I've never spoken for 45 minutes before. It's usually 3 hours." Well, yeah, that was a very special moment. Another very special moment was when the day that we heard that ODOT changed their mind to go back to the original location. That was humongous. There have been beautiful people in and out of the country fair forever, and that's part of the magic. Some of my favorite acts, Mose Wright is such a spectacular performer. I don't see very many sword swallowers and fire breathers, but he's really one of the world's best. Avner the Eccentric used to come to the country fair. There's a magician's magician. He's such a special performer and hasn't been back for a long, long time. Of course, the Karamazovs amaze us every time they're there, and our old legends, Artis the Spoon Man and Tom Noddy and Baby Gramps and Jim Page, and gee, it goes on and on. I think that we are gifted at the country fair with the quality of entertainment that we have, with the quality of the vending that we have, and the food is just international cuisine at its best. All of those things make it such an extraordinary event, and maybe the best show on Mother Earth.
What would you like to see in the future for the fair?
I'd like to see a 9-day event. With people not necessarily open to the public for 9 days, but if it were open on the first weekend and the last weekend, and that the community could have the event happen and have special speakers come in, special workshops, special performers if possible, there could be lots going on. I also think that there is a potential to give more benefit to the community from the proceeds of the country fair. I mean, I know that the country fair is really just doing outstanding job, but I think that there is yet a greater potential to acquire more proceeds through the extension of the time the affair happens, and to give back to the community for those people that are slipping through the cracks.
And is there anything you'd like to say to the fair family? Anything else?
It's such a special event. Just be good family, love each other, take it home.
And what else? What else you have in your notes here? You want to?
I think I've covered most of the things that I wrote down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's, lots and lots of stories, but that's all I thought of so far. It's coherent.
Anything? Well, you kind of covered one about that muddy time that was like crazy time, and I know Cindy Wooten talked about one time the bikers came in and she didn't know what to do with them or something like that. Or what was her name? I interviewed her last year. She's one of the early folks. She talked about, this was back in the early 70s. She talked about she told all the people that the cops were going to come out for permit inspection or something, and keep, stow all your pot, don't get naked, get your clothes on and everything, and then they come into main camp, and then there's a big bowl of pot sitting there on the picnic table right for the sheriff, so she was very embarrassed and knew that no matter her best efforts to try to clean up the fair, something like this was always going to happen, type of thing. So I don't know if you could think of any other kind of ironic or goofy, situations you had to deal with, like that kind of stuff.
Well, there's one security story that's kind of become legend. There's a couple, but this one most people have heard about. It was maybe 91 or 92, and it was Thursday night before the fair, and I think it started out with this young kid, about 20 or so, shaved head, pretty wild, and apparently induced. He started a fight or an argument with one of our security people, and I heard that he tried to light fire to the guy's beard. And then he escaped from that and jumped into a vehicle, a pickup, that was not his, and started driving around the parking lots at 50 miles an hour. And country fair at Thursday night, people are not accustomed to that happening. So he was actually trying to run people down and driving down the aisles and Miss Piggy. And we were reluctant to actually chase him, but what we did was we got vehicles on either side of him so that when he got to the end of a row, he had to go someplace, and he went right into the trees, and he jumped out of the pickup, and pretty sure, you have to ask Palmer to corroborate on this, but I think it was Parker that was the first guy to get to him. He jumped on him, took away the keys, and then other people started coming in. I was at that point, I was on the backup management squad, and I had called the sheriffs and was waiting for a sheriff to come onto property, so I was going to take him down to that point in the property. So when we arrived, it was Earl McMillan was sheriff. He's a large, red-headed guy, very short, cropped hair. You would probably call him correctly a redneck. And so he arrived on the scene, and Palmer and that group of people stood this kid up, and the sheriff walked over and handcuffed him, and the kid started yelling obscenities and you better kill me now because I'm going to come back and kill you later and stuff like that. And it was just really off the wall. And then he said, the hippie dream is dead. And Earl McMullen said, the hippie dream is not dead. I believe in that dream. Now don't you tell me that.
That's the sheriff.
Yeah, that's the sheriff.
Wow.
And the rest of us were just alarmed at that, and we knew that we were going to have a good time. from there on. And it turned out that that was the first year that Earl had been on that beat, and he was there for another 10 years or something. He was there for a long time before he retired out of that service. And he was fabulous to work with. We accomplished a lot with him. The cooperation level was real high. And they would tell us often, we would rather work the country fair than a football game or a rodeo. You guys have it together, you take care of your own people, and when we show up, the problems are solved except taking the people off the side. So we like that. We like you, Earl.
Now, tell me, you said it wasn't, it's more of a Ron Chase story, but just maybe so I can ask better questions of him or something. Tell me about, there was some legal action before '82 and the money, when the fair was purchased, there was some legal issues going on there that provided a down payment or a pot of money toward that, or where you were around the fair during that time.
Oh yeah,
so.
I was involved. I was actually on the board in '80, and let's see, Ron was the general manager, basically. I don't know if he actually was bestowed that title, but that was his function. He was the general manager. And Sandra Bauer, they were kind of both carrying the load. And they were the leaders among that group of people, and everybody else was contributing but following at the same time. So coinciding with, well, we started a land search in about '80, and really couldn't find any other properties. There was one out by Five Rivers, but it was way too far away, and it was the only other one that was big enough. And then there was a surveyor's screw up in the middle of Willamette Valley that was 8 feet wide and a mile long that we joked about. We could have paths here and, you know, booths here, and then you just go out the other end. But in the end, it turned out that the best option for us was to try to raise the money to buy the land from the WAC. It was Western Aero Corporation, I think was the name of it. And so Ron spearheaded the money drive, wrote a program so people could donate and make loans and become charter members through those functions. And then there were two other large things that we raised money with. One of them was the Grateful Dead concert in the fall of '82, which there was $25,000. And thanks to the Kesey family laid it down in that period. They really made it happen. And then the other one was coincidental with the fundraising efforts. Archie Weinstein and some of the other people on the Lane County Commissioners Board at the time were trying to find ways to shut the country fair down. And what they came up with was that they were going to require a bond for the performance, for the permit. And the way that it was worded in the ordinance was unconstitutional, because it said that the county may require a bond. Well, you do or you don't. You don't leave it up to the political discretion of whoever's on the board at the time. So we took it to court. Jill Hyman took this to court and won, as that was an unconstitutional ordinance. And so we got 25 grand out of that. I think it was 25 or thereabouts from Lane County, which contributed to our purchase of the land. And then we raised, I think we raised, you should ask Ron about this, I think it was $100,000 that was our down payment, and that was, we raised 50 internally, 25 the Grateful Dead, 25 from the county, and then we had 150,000 on the contract. I think it was $250,000 on the contract. 100,000 down. So, you know, back in those days, the population of the country fair was about or less than a good day now. For the 3 days, we might have 16 or 17,000 people.
Back in the early '80s.
Yeah, late '70s, early '80s, that was the population. And the culture changed a little bit. There became more of us, for one. The popularity of the country fair surged. And the leadership with the promotion and advertising also took big leaps. So now we cut it off at 18,000 people in a day. So it's a lot different to have 40 or 50,000 people coming in.
And you say the Kesey family was instrumental with getting the Dead to play at the fair property in '82?
The Kesey family produced the show and took the hit as well. There were a lot of people, but the Kesey family came through with the contract and made it possible for the country fair to buy the property.
Were you around in '72 when the Dead played the fair?
No, I was not. I started an event in 1969, the same year that the country fair started, which was called the Stone Soul Picnic, and it was a similar type of a thing in Corvallis. So I was running those about the same time as the country fair was going on.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was about 2001 that we started the spoken word program, and there was only one person in it. It was Alex Olson, and she came in a rather impromptu. But then in 2002, we really connected with the community at Country Fair and with Ram Dass and Paul Krasner, and there were a dozen other guests. That was really the kickoff to the spoken word program. 2003, I think we followed up with Stephen Gaskin and Holly Near and a few folks like that, and it grew. I think there was 24 people that year, and the following year there was 38. I swore I'd never do 38 people again, so this year we did 57. Originally we were thinking that it would be fun to have some icons of the culture, of our culture, people in leadership positions to come in and just share and talk about what they're doing. And now what has actually happened is that, yes, that has continued, but workshops have also developed out of the program, and we continue to bring in new speakers as well as have some returnees. And the feedback from the community is that it's some people have called it the missing link in the intellectual stimulation for what the fair used to have, and didn't for a while, but now it's back. So I'm quite inspired to be a part of this fairly large group of people right now that is producing the spoken word program at the Oregon Country Fair. Sometimes people ask, well, how do you choose who you have in the lineup with the spoken word? And first off, I try to get gender balance as close as I can. Then I try to get a wide spread of ages, from the very youngest people that I can find to the oldest people that I can find. And so far it's been from about 12 years to about 80 years old. And then the topics has been a real challenge. I've decided, rather than just have what you might consider traditional spoken word, to branch out into educational topics, to actual spoken word, hip-hop, poetry, but also to have authors and educators and astrologers and scientists, and get a broad range of intellectual material to come into the program.